If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Even with legal tampering, the ripple effect of Captain Kirk heading to Hotlanta, not just for the draft, but for other superstars. We've got all that and more. I'm Jason Fitz, and it is time for Inside Coverage. Welcome to Inside Coverage, part of the Zero Blitz family, where we dive into the how and why on all things NFL. Charles Robinson, Jori, Epstein. I'm Jason Fitz, still hitting puberty. I don't know why. Every single
voice,
week,
little voice pop, little voice break there.
Every week, every week I bring the energy like a 12-year-old because I sound like a 12-year-old that's in middle school that's excited. I'm excited, guys, because we got a ton to get into. I've been particularly excited about this conversation because we all went through free agency frenzy, legal tampering that led to signing. That let me start with this a very basic question, though. All right, C-Rob, you've been doing this a long time. Is the system now better than it was before when at midnight, all of a sudden the clock turned midnight and everybody just signed willy-nilly out of everywhere? Do you like this better now?
I guess. I mean, I don't understand. like the tampering period thing to me, it's okay. So are they tampering ahead of the tampering period? Oh, to me, I feel like it's better than the lies we all took apart. As you said, midnight, so-and-so is on so-and-so's doorstep. Remember those stories where you'd have like the coach and the GM would fly to, meet the marquee free agent on their doorstep as soon as the clock hit 12:01. Yeah, I mean, I guess it just eliminates this whole idea that we're lying. But it hasn't really eliminated it because we go to the combine and there are coaches there, there are GMs there. They all have meetings set up with agents to talk about players they're not supposed to be talking about, to hammer out deals they're not supposed to be hammering out. So it's still kind of a farce. But I'm glad we're going to get into this tampering stuff today because I do have I have a good tampering story that I can't put names on, but it's a story that will, I think, showcases how bad this is.
Well, let's get right to part of the reason I asked this question, because there is some pretty significant news right now with a couple of major signings. You have Kirk Cousins at his introductory press conference, something that, Jori, I know you're writing on right now, making a statement that makes it sound like there was some tampering, possibly. You have Saquon and you have James Franklin coming out saying Howie Roseman talked directly to Saquon. So let's start with the Kirk element of this, Jori. Like, how big of a deal is it that we're parsing out statements in a press conference to figure out if he talked to somebody he wasn't supposed to?
Yeah, what makes me laugh about all this is Kirk went so far out of his way during the press conference to be like, I trust my agent, Mike McCartney, who's been doing this for a while. I kind of let him handle it. And then he mentions, let's get this exact quote. He called Drew Brees to ask him about Terry Fontenot, the Falcons general manager who worked with Brees for a long time with the Saints. And this is a direct quote. He goes, I said, Drew, I can't talk to teams, but I can talk to you. And then asks him to tell him about Terry. So Kirk was trying so hard. And then the only reason this even comes out is because he was trying to thank all the little people, so to say, who aren't in front of the scenes of our trainer is great, our PR is great. Not only do I love the owner, the head coach, and the general manager, but everyone around here I think is really good. And then he accidentally let slip that maybe he met with or talked to the head athletic trainer. So what's hard is that with the Kirk Cousins situation, this is an actual Falcons employee, so it would be easier in some ways to be like, this is someone who works for your team, who violated the rules. You violated the rules. Let's do it. Versus James Franklin, who I know we'll get to him. But if he's saying, well, Saquon told me that he talked to Howie, James Franklin doesn't have evidence necessarily. It's not like
right.
Howie. It's not like he's like, hey. Yeah. Right. He doesn't. James Franklin does not work for an NFL team. Howie can deny it. And it's not like Saquon sent him a recording that he's now going to turn over.
Right.
And so I think the Eagles are actually probably a little safer here than the Falcons, which is a shame because Kirk was just trying to be nice. And the last thing I'll say is that the Eagles part is just so ironic because it's been less than a year since right before the NFL draft, we hear that the Eagles are getting to move up about 30 picks in addition to getting another draft pick the following year from the Arizona Cardinals because Howie Roseman and his front office kind of went after Arizona for recruiting Jonathan Gannon before the deadline when they could actually talk to him. Jonathan Gannon was the Eagles defensive coordinator at the time. He's now the Cardinals head coach. And so it's kind of one of those things where I just want to be like, guys, if it's not anything super drastic, here's $700 million to talk to us 2 days in advance, just let it be. You all know you tamper. Is it really worth going after someone else's tampering when you're about to do it yourself?
One of Howie's friends said to me, I think he literally did this just because he wanted a better draft pick. He's like, I don't even think he was that upset. I just think he saw
Right.
a way to finagle draft compensation. And so he's like, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So,
Well, and I started reaching out to some people before we got the official statement from the league about whether they'd get into it. And I think there's two elements here. To me, like, the league doesn't really care. That's my opinion. That's not what the league is saying. I think the league, one, if there's like all of this publicity around it, they have to do something at least for show. And then two, if the teams make them go after it, then they're like, okay, well, we're not going to ignore it. But I don't think the league wants to enforce this.
I'm sure the Giants and the Cardinals are both like, yeah, bull. Like, you need to do something here. At least look into it. Look at the phone records. Here's the thing about tampering that's funny to me is if you get caught, you're just stupid. You don't know what you're doing. Like, it's because everybody's doing it. And I'm not even going to say the years because I know people will try to pick this apart. But during the course of my career here, I had a prominent agent who had a prominent quarterback who told me that it was coming up on free agency. The season had ended. And he literally said to me, ex-coach has been talking to my quarterback throughout this season. And I was like, he was talking to your quarterback? And he's like, yeah. He's like, and I'm like, well, like, that's like, there's a huge problem here. He said, no, he knows what he's doing. I was like, how does he know what he's doing? And he was like, well, his wife would call the wife of my quarterback, and then they would just talk on their wives' phones. This happened over the extent of an entire season. Like, it was, the coach was unhappy with his current quarterback. This other quarterback he wanted, he knew that quarterback was potentially going to hit free agency. This was prior to the quarterback getting another deal done. So he had been talking to the quarterback directly during the course of an entire season, basically talking to him about what they could do, what the scheme's like, all these different things. Like, it straight up, and never got caught because it was simply two people using the phones of their wives. And to me at the time, that was shocking, but he's like, this happens all the time. He's like, this, everybody in the league knows how to tamper. You don't use your own phone. You know, there's a limited scope in terms of what the league could even chase down. And he was like, I don't even think legally the league could ask for the phones of these wives because they're not part of the NFL system. There's no agreements in place. There's no arbitration for wives of coaches or players. So yeah, I thought it was kind of entertaining. I always like when it's like a third party though, that accidentally busts somebody, like a James Franklin saying something, and then I'm sure there was some communication at some point that like, hey, put a cork in it. We'll talk about how this came together and,
But to the point you're both making, though, like, if you get caught, it just takes a level of stupid, right? Like, and I'll go back to the drug testing policy in the NFL. I was amazed when I first started meeting athletes, when I first got into this business, and I was hanging out with an agent who did a seminar. And one thing that agent did in the seminar for all of his clients was say, hey, here are the days you're going to be tested, which means all of a sudden they would backtrack it. He had somebody on his staff that called every one of the players that he represented and said, today's the last day you can smoke weed. This is several years ago, but today's the last day. So when a player fails a drug test, I've always looked at that and thought, man, that's a level of stupid, because somebody told you, hey, all you got to do is not smoke weed for these like 5 weeks and you're going to be just fine. When it happens,
assuming for what it's worth that they haven't been caught in the past, because once they're in the program, they get tested all the time.
Much different situation. But when you're talking first-time offenders, like, all you got to do, somebody calls you and says, hey, man, keep it clean for the next X amount of time. That's all you got to do. When you're talking about the tampering situation, to your point, C-Rob, with all of these systems in place, all you got to do is not be stupid, and you should be able to get away with it. So if you get caught, I kind of just love I'm the guy sitting in the back eating the popcorn, sipping the tea, saying this is glorious, because I cannot believe, to Jori's point, Kirk's just trying to be a nice guy. And I can understand why he would want to talk to the trainer, considering he's rehabbing an Achilles injury that is substantial. I would want to talk to the trainer. I can see an innocence behind all of that, and you still somehow made the wrong move.
Well, I also feel like maybe we should allow players to talk to the trainers. Like, that's the funny thing. Is like, I actually think that should be something that's allowed. Like, if you don't want to talk to head coach, general manager, he also didn't say, he had said yesterday, and this was on Wednesday he gave it. So it would have been one day. It's not like he was talking about 2 weeks ago. So if anything, I think that if there's a serious injury, maybe players should be allowed to talk to the trainers at the next place during that window.
I mean, it's their futures at stake. Wouldn't it make sense to at least be able to talk to somebody and find out what the plan is? But that being said, the rule isn't in place. And, C-Rob, oversimplification, but if they really want that, they could go in and collectively bargain that next time, like they didn't. So the rules are what the rules are. That's me being, sort of the rule nerd, I should say right now. But the rules are what they are. Everybody, the players know it as well as the coaches. I am a little surprised, though. I mean, James Franklin knows better. He's a head coach, and he knows that everything he says is going to be just absolutely split apart. I'm a little surprised that coach offers anything up that he doesn't have to offer in that conversation.
But the funny thing about this is, as long as Howie didn't call Saquon on his phone, it's as simple as James Franklin walking it back by going, I just misunderstood. Saquon told me the story. I thought he had talked directly to Howie. I made an assumption that he was. I guess apparently he wasn't. They were talking through Saquon's agent, and I just misunderstood it. It's as simple as that. It's like Jori said. It's basically impossible to prove unless you were just straight up stupid. So we're making too much out of this. It doesn't. This doesn't really matter. The money is what got the deal done, not the phone call. Okay, what negates someone tampering with Saquon? A bigger check. That's it. That's all. That's all you got to do. Just add a decimal point, add a zero, which would, probably don't add a zero. That's a lot.
Okay, so here's what I'd ask. What's today? March 14th, 2024. Happy Pi Day, by the way. Do you guys think that the Eagles, Falcons, both or neither will be penalized within the next year?
I don't think the Eagles will. I just can't see it being provable. It's as simple as a phone call taking place and everybody getting their story straight, unless, again, it was something that was done stupidly. The Falcons, I don't know. I mean, the Falcons, it depends. Did Kirk call the trainer on his phone? Was it, or was it a situation where, the agent calls the trainer and then agent hands the phone, Mike McCartney hands the phone to Kirk? I don't know. I feel like, obviously, look, the Cardinals got busted on Gannon. So it's not impossible that somebody gets held responsible for this, but I don't know. The money is what closed these situations. It wasn't the stupid rule of that, who are you talking to? Or are you not talking to somebody directly? And not only that, this isn't like Don Yee trying to get Sean Payton and Tom Brady, to frickin' Miami. It's not Brian Flores saying that the owner met with Tom Brady on his yacht. This is just so paltry at this point.
I feel like
two things I think that are worth keeping in mind. The first of which you mentioned, C-Rob, is one, how much did this actually impact the outcome? And then two, it's interesting because on one hand, I just feel like the Eagles were kind of bold to go after the Cardinals last year when the Eagles know that they've tampered plenty of times. I wonder if teams are a little more willing to be like, okay, but we haven't done it with head coaches because those come around less often versus free agency when literally the entire combine, everyone's meeting with everybody. I still think it's just so dicey though, because even the head coach element, it's the number of times that you hear hey, Kellen Moore met Brandon Staley on the sideline of their game and they're like, we should keep in touch. And I mean, this happens all the time.
Yeah, by the way, Jori, I think there'll be a small punishment of some sort to the Falcons, some sort of slap on the wrist that nobody really considers, and they'll use,
which is what, a 7th round pick type thing.
Yeah,
or what
I would say 6th, 7th round pick somewhere in there. And they take that from them for a trainer conversation that shouldn't have happened. But everybody feels like Kirk is just such a great guy that it gets pushed under a little bit.
I wonder if the Falcons. I mean, remember they got caught piping crowd noise into the dome, and they got nailed for that. So I wonder if if the league says, okay, how many violations now is this that, under Arthur Blank are you getting, popped on, because that happened when Arthur Blank owned the team too. So
no, you're right about that. The way they stack up, that could be an interesting thing I hadn't thought of for sure. Speaking of the Falcons, by the way, they are in the news. Let's get to some of the official late news that we're getting right now. Free agency officially started yesterday, but we have some breaking news. Desmond Ridder traded to Arizona for Rondale Moore. So Desmond Ridder, not only the future, but obviously not even part of the plans at a backup level. Arizona gets themselves a backup quarterback that they can have. Rondale Moore becomes another weapon for the Falcons. This is sort of breaking. So, C-Rob, any initial reaction to this?
Well, it's bad for Clayton Tune, who I thought they liked, who was the backup last year. behind Kyler and Josh Dobbs. I will say this: it gives them an option on the table for, if they get to a point with Kyler where it goes in the wrong direction. Like, it's not going in the wrong direction right now. Things are good, right? But I mean, it gives them an experienced young player to look at in practice and to go, hey, is this a guy that, potentially, if we have to move on from Kyler, do we like this young guy enough to potentially work him into our plans for the future? I'm trying to, off the top of my head, I can't tell you how many years of control are left on Desmond's deal.
Yes, this would be, he has 2024 and 2025.
So 2 years, 2 years
of
control. Okay. Now shift over to Kyler's deal. Can you do that real quick and tell me what is the cap hit in 2 years on Kyler after the 2025 season? What's the cap hit?
And it looks like here after 2025, the following year, it jumps up. The cap hit jumps up to $55.5 million.
Okay, so post June 1 designation, you split that in half. By then, the salary cap will be at 280, right? So I think it potentially sets up a situation where if, let's say, you're entering the 2025 season, you're going, what's the out after the 2024 season?
33. It's 33 million, basically.
I mean, you could absorb 33 in 1 year on one cap, right? They don't. The Falcons don't have a lot of big extension players. They've gotten a lot of money off the books. You could absorb that 33 in 1 year. You could split it over 2 years, which is a very easy kind of hit to absorb. You get an entire year to look at Ridder. So you've looked at a young guy. You got a young guy who's also got starting experience. You don't have to worry about your backup not having starting experience. Plus, you get a year to look at him, and you have insurance in case there's some sort of wrong way scenario that plays out with Kyler Murray, or let's say there's another season-ending injury, right? And they're like, do we want to keep going down this road with this guy? We didn't draft him. That's 2 season-ending injuries. It's all about having flexibility, I think, at the end of the season. And there are worse things to do than to grab a young player who they might still believe has some ability.
Yeah, and Jori, that's why I would say that they also have flexibility at the wide receiver position. They can get rid of Rondale Moore and get better than Rondale where they're sitting in the draft. Even if they trade down, they can get guys that are more considered to be a better lock at a number one wide receiver than Rondale Moore is at this point.
And I just think so many teams view quarterbacks as not only about who's going to play, but first of all, who's going to play. Second of all, who's the backup is going to be. Because remember, how many teams did we see lose their starting quarterback for the entire season last year, from the Bengals to the Jets, and it goes on and on. And when you have these backup quarterbacks, and I mean, I was talking to a GM during that time who I believe he was saying that backup quarterback for them was a top 20 position on the 53-man roster, if I have that correctly. It was at least 20, if not higher. Of like, forget the fact that you have 22 guys and you need all these receivers, you need all these DBs. Like, backup quarterback is important. And if Desmond Ridder, they believe, is an upgrade, then that is relevant. And also an asset in terms of developing. I mean, think about what the Patriots once did with Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, if you can have a quarterback play well, whether or not you can use him in-house, it doesn't really matter. Like, you are going to have value out of that. I also think it's worth noting that when the Cardinals got rid of DeAndre Hopkins, they had 22 million dead cap or so, I believe, 22.6. And they took that. It was fine. You moved on. The cap is growing. And the last thing I'll say on that is that, like, think about this. Okay, 33 million dead cap, which, by the way, right now, it doesn't seem like you're going to need it. Kyler is healthy and playing well at the moment. So this is more an if than a we are at that point. The Broncos, might I remind you, are taking an $85 million dead cap. That is like 2.5, nearly 3 times as much as it. So 33 million is not much. So I just think this gives you so much flexibility for starter, backup quarterback, and assets.
Also suggestive, I would say, that maybe the Cardinals feel like maybe they're a team to contend for the playoffs this year. Because typically when you see teams seek out a veteran backup, it's because they're sitting there going, we don't want to be stuck in a bad situation. We have a good team. Let's not be the Jets and have to plug in Zach Wilson and watch the entire season get flushed. Let's not be the Rams, who, when Matt Stafford goes down, we're kind of like, oh man, we didn't prepare enough. And, the rookie that we drafted isn't even in the building. And I think Indy's like a good example of that, right? Richardson goes down, Gardner Minshew steps in. And you saw they were competitive over the course of the season. So maybe the Cardinals are sitting there going, guess what? we're going to be competitive a team this year. Maybe you don't expect a lot of us, but we're going to have a full year of Kyler. Maybe we've got Marvin Harrison Jr. on the roster or whoever else that we get in the top 10. They feel good about themselves right now. So,
but let me take what you're both saying though and push back from the other side of the Falcons. Like the Falcons are supposed to be at least a division favorite, and they would consider themselves a powerhouse in the NFC, right? So sure, they add Rondale Moore, which is another weapon for an offense that has a ton of weapons. But last time I checked, Kirk isn't a spring chicken, and he is coming off of an Achilles injury. Is it really worth Rondale Moore to not have a backup option for Atlanta at this point? Like maybe it's Zach Wilson all over again. You just got to get him out of the room because it's never going to work. But if I'm the Falcons, C-Rob, do I love the fact that I now have to figure out what I'm doing at backup quarterback, considering I have an older guy coming off a substantial injury?
Okay, let's play this game. Who's the agent for Kirk Cousins?
C-Rob looks so mischievous.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is a good game. Mike McCartney.
Who's the agent for Josh Dobbs, who was the backup who stepped in for Kirk Cousins last year in Minnesota?
Mike McCartney.
Mike McCartney represents Kirk Cousins and Josh Dobbs, and they've been in the same quarterback room together. And Josh Dobbs is a great support backup quarterback. And they ran the same offense last year in Minnesota that they're going to run this year in Atlanta. And now there's a need for a backup. Maybe it seems like a good place for Josh Dobbs to go down to Atlanta and once again be in a support role with Kirk Cousins in an offense that he's already played with and with a quarterback he knows well. There's that, right? There's also the lingering, although I just can't see it happening now. But I mean, Atlanta had interest in Justin Fields, right? Justin Fields is now developed, and we're going to talk about this in a second, as someone who I think you have to start to look at backup situations in the NFL and see if there's a fit out there. Now, I think Dobbs is a much better fit in this scenario because of everybody knowing each other, knowing the offense, the familiarity, all these different things. But yeah, start scouring the backup quarterback options for the Atlanta Falcons and what makes sense. To me, Dobbs makes perfect sense in this scenario.
I like it. Yeah, my thing about Justin Fields is like, if they were really so into that style, wouldn't they have gone? I mean, like we saw the Lamar Jackson thing that they had no interest in. And obviously Lamar and Justin are not the same players, and I know that they're also not the same price, but Justin's not as cheap as he used to be, given that this fifth-year option's coming up. And also on that note, and I know this is a tangent, but like when everyone's saying, does Brian Burns realize that the Niners are willing to pay way more than him in terms of to acquire his rights than the Giants did? Yeah, because he had a very different amount of his rookie contract left. And so now you have to pay the guy. So I feel like that is being left out of those conversations.
Speaking of pay the guy, let's get to somebody that got paid in a bit of a surprising move. Calvin Ridley to the Tennessee Titans, 4 years, $92 million, $50 million guaranteed, according to reports. And a little bit confusing to me. See, Rob, I'll be honest. Like, look, I always love great players coming in, but like at some point, who are the Titans? What are they trying to do? Why Calvin Ridley right now for this team in this moment?
They need a vertical threat. I mean, they really do. They need someone with separation. And I mean, that's the best part of Ridley's game. I think you could argue is downfield speed. I think Ridley's performance in Jacksonville, I think it could have been better. I think it was hurt by the fact that Lawrence was not healthy. It was interesting when I was at the Combine, I had somebody tell me that Lawrence wasn't healthy for a lot of last season, not just after the ankle injury. So that there were some other nagging things that he was dealing with. And so, you know, you could argue that even though he had an okay season last year, it might have been a little bit depressed by what was going on at the quarterback spot. But look, Will Levis has got a big arm. He's all about throwing vertical throws, and you need a wideout who can fly. Calvin Ridley can absolutely do that. What's curious to me about this, it's not curious because it's different management now, but I remember being at the owners' meetings at the Breakers Hotel, standing behind John Robinson, then GM of the Tennessee Titans. And Tyreek Hill had done he had been traded and he had done his deal with the Miami Dolphins. Devontae Adams he was with the Raiders and he had done his deal with the Raiders. And I remember there was another GM that did the flyby on John and said, you know, something along the lines of wide receiver money is, wow, it's really big. And he knew that obviously AJ Brown was sitting there going, I want a contract extension here. And John made a remark, something along the lines of, yeah, we're not doing that kind of money at receiver. And I'm like, well, you are. You just won't be around. Maybe the 25 million versus, what is it? 3 years or 4 years and 92. You guys can do the math on that. I'm not a math whiz. Obviously, it's 23 million. 23 million versus 25 million APY guarantees that are not all that dissimilar, and a younger player who's already in your system. Maybe if AJ Brown, that deal gets done, John Robinson might still be there. Mike Vrabel might still be there. Like maybe we're looking at a different situation. Instead, neither is there, and Calvin Ridley is getting money that AJ Brown probably. AJ Brown, honestly, this deal, AJ Brown might have done this deal with the Titans. A couple of years ago, he might have said, "Yeah, okay, close enough. 23, gets me there, and I stay in house, and I'm happy with the development of the offense, and and then we'll do another deal after that, and I'll try to end my career here."
Yeah, I think it's interesting because also we saw that not only did John Robinson make that trade or allow the trade of AJ Brown to the Eagles on his watch, but Amy Adams seemed to feel pretty strongly about that in terms of how long he kept his job after. And they did not like seeing what AJ Brown was able to do with the Philadelphia Eagles. So they definitely, I feel like since that point, have felt like they needed to go get a guy. And I like it. I mean, I feel like personally, you got to be excited for a guy like Calvin of like, look, he definitely made a mistake. He should not have gambled, et cetera, et cetera. But to have the mental health challenges he had and the gambling challenges he had and now be able to make generational money, it's like kind of a good feel-good story of like guys can get back.
And Ridley too, remember, he did that piece for the Players Tribune, which you could argue who wrote it. Did he really write it? Whatever. But that was impressive to me. Like that was something where I remember when he went out, don't you remember? There were opinions. Some people were like, oh, he's done. Like because we weren't yet familiar with players gambling on football, let alone on their own teams. And we were like, oh my God, it's the uncrossable line. Now we're like, well, yeah, you get crossed a lot. Maybe it's not as bad as we once thought. But the fact that he hit it head on was like, fine, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to step out. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. I'm going to tell you what my mindset was. At that point, when I read through that, I was like, all right, you know what? Mistakes happen. I feel like this is adequately explained. He deserves an opportunity to go out there and get himself back on track. And as Jori said, I mean, it is kind of a feel-good situation that somebody can make a mistake. It was a sizable mistake, and actually survive it.
And as much as I'm curious where the Titans are headed, because I don't think the roster is particularly good right now, I do need to at least acquiesce the fact that Will Levis was the second-round draft pick. So that means you get 4 years, not 5 on him. They've given him some reps, but you've got to give him weapons to figure out if he's the guy. And that's going to accelerate a little bit because at some point you don't have as much time. I know franchise tag, all these things, but I'll never fault a team that has a quarterback they may believe in for going out and getting weapons for him. I just am not sure if we're doing the old wins above replacement. I don't know if Calvin Ridley's going to a team where it's going to make them staggeringly better, but it will give them better view of who Will Levis is, which becomes one of the most important things that they can do this year with Brian Callahan as their head coach.
In Fitz, it gives them flexibility at their draft pick, right? I mean, you got, what's their pick? Number 7, right? 7th overall pick. And so you're sitting there and you're going, well, now the tackle should absolutely be in play for us. Like we could take the best left tackle off the board. We have Peter Skoronski. We just signed Cushenberry. Okay, we got some assets on the offensive line all of a sudden. Like that's a great thing for us. We've got a backfield with Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears that's different in terms of the style that we used to run. We're not just going to beat you to death. We're going to instead, we're going to have a lot of versatility with these two backs. And now it gives you 3 wideouts where Treylon Burks, who's clearly not gotten himself on track. Well, know what? Now you're the third option, man. Like you should have an opportunity
next to Hopkins
here.
And Ridley, that's pretty good.
Yeah, next to Hopkins and Ridley, you're probably not going to have the number 1 or number 2 DB rolling to you. Obviously it's going to depend where you line up on the field, but I think it even takes a little bit of pressure off of him to have to immediately produce, gives him an opportunity to click himself into place. And maybe if that happens, when Hopkins ages out or contracts out, however you want to look at, what his future could be, maybe you turn Burks into a viable number 2, which I think really was the hope last year. And obviously that got derailed.
Right. And I think I go back to something Daniel Jeremiah, NFL Network's draft expert, said leading into the combine, which is when he was talking about Bryce Young and he said, I always ask, does a young quarterback have the 3 Ps? pass catchers, play callers, and protection. He felt like Bryce Young had none of the three. I would argue that Will Levis in Tennessee now has improved all three of those. He's got Calvin in addition to Hopkins and Treylon Burks. They got Lloyd Cushenberry. They've upgraded their offensive line. And Brian Callahan should be an excellent play caller. He comes from a good track record. Oh, by the way, he brought his dad Bill with them. So it's not only an improvement in offensive line players, but also an improvement in the offensive line coaching, because you now have arguably top 5 offensive line coach, if not top 2. I feel like after Stoutland and Philly, I don't know that there's anyone else who's like really, really contending for that title. And so I feel like kind of what we're saying is you can see very early into Will Levis's contract, especially because you're not going to have the 5th-year option on him based on when you drafted him, what he's able to do, what he's not able to do, and how you want to build your franchise accordingly.
Next to Stoutland, I would argue that Callahan is one of the most valuable assistant coaches in the entire NFL, right? So you potentially have offensively, you've potentially upgraded it at head coach just because you're pairing an offensive guy with the quarterback that you're grooming. Again, being able to add Callahan into that mix and what he can do with that offensive line I think is immense given his track record. You've added between last year's draft, this year's draft, and then free agency, you've added a center, a guard who should be pretty damn good if he plays in that position, a tackle who, if you take the first tackle off the board and say it's Joe Alt, is supposed to be a hell of a tackle, right? Okay, so all that's been upgraded. Yeah, you've upgraded skill position pieces. Ran Carthon, okay, like I said on Tennessee radio today, I was, the whole let so-and-so cook, let Ran run, right? Like that's the phrase I'm coining as GM, let Ran run. He's added Cheeto, right? Awuzie. He added Nick Folk. It's a pretty big deal. Like, God, thank God. Like, let's resolve a kicker. Added Mason Rudolph at backup quarterback, who's got experience, I think, down the stretch showed. I would say he's a quality backup quarterback in the NFL at the very least. To me, they've added some pretty solid pieces in free agency, and I don't know if it'll work. Maybe it won't. But I think you are doing the one thing coming out of last season that you had to do, which is to go, we got to give Will Levis the best shot we can. Like, we got to find out if this guy can get this done, and why not give him as much as we can going into, the passing, program in this offseason. So,
and it feels to that end too, C-Rob, like this is just an era of change for the Titans. No Derrick Henry, no Ryan Tannehill. Like, this is just an era of change. So fans are going to have to get used to change. And the quicker that Brian Callahan, sorry, Freudian slip, the quicker that Brian can sort of come in and identify exactly what his style is going to be, I think the better everybody will understand it. Now, all of this conversation about A.J. Brown sort of leads me to the Eagles, obviously, and Saquon's headed to the Eagles. Jori, I know you wrote about this, but I'll go back to my buddy Kevin Nagandi, lifelong diehard Eagles fan, all the way up to the signing, was tweeting, the Eagles just don't do this. They're not going to spend money at the running back position. This isn't how they do business. And then, 20 minutes later, Saquon's an Eagle. Like, what causes the change here in the business approach, considering this is the same front office we're used to?
I think the question is, did they actually change their business approach? Because I definitely agree that in the last 5 and almost 10 years, the Eagles have had really bargain bin guys at running back. They're getting 13 touchdowns off a guy they're paying $1 million. I was looking at the difference in the percentage of cap they used at the running back position compared to their division rivals in the Giants and the Cowboys. And it's like 5, even 9 times some years as much cap space used by the other teams. That said, I talked to someone who used to work with the Eagles. Let's just leave it at that, and his familiarity with their decision making. And I love this quote from him. He said, I think they have some very disciplined principles when it comes to building through the lines, but they also have some high-end art collector tendencies where they will pursue high-end talent and pay premiums as needed. And so I think when you look at this, Howie says, I'm not going to pay a guy just to go run behind our offensive line big money. But if I think a guy can run, and I think he can be a pass catcher, and I think he can be a blocker, and I think he can elevate our scheme all around, create all of these mismatches and confusions for the defense beside Jalen Hurts behind this offensive line, then yeah, I'm willing to pay money. And oh, by the way, it's still a little bit less than we had to pay for this guy a few years ago. And then I talked to someone in the building, and I was like, just explain this to me. Like, make this make sense why you thought that this was the time to pay the money to Saquon. And they like kept talking about Christian McCaffrey, and they're like, I don't want to make this all about Christian McCaffrey. But I think what happened is the Eagles looked at what the 49ers did, I said, okay, there's this running back who is versatile. He's shown a great ceiling. He hasn't stayed healthy, but he also hasn't had a good team around him. He hasn't had a great offensive line. And oh, by the way, they dealt second, third, fourth, fifth, maybe even a 6th-round pick for him also. Second, third, fourth, and fifth, and they still had to pay him. And all of a sudden, when he has the weapons around him and a good offensive line, he stays healthy. He's leading the league in scrimmage yards. He's leading the league in scrimmage touchdowns, and they saw this model. So I don't think anyone is saying that right now Saquon Barkley is Christian McCaffrey relative to what they've done the last few years. But I think they're saying that there is a model for a versatile running back who joins a more talented, healthier team to start taking off and allowing a team to get over the hump, which I think it's hard to say the 49ers didn't do, even if they haven't won the Super Bowl.
Well, first and foremost,
give me all the holes in the argument, C-Rob.
First and foremost, I like it when you say, I talked to someone who used to work for the Eagles, and then you tell me what they say, and I'm like, I know who that is based on the use of, art collecting. I'm like, yeah, I bet you I know who this is. First off, it's a 2-year deal, right? If we're being honest about when you could opt out of that deal and, absorb the hit or split the hit as opposed to in one. It's at worst, you've put yourself on the hook for 2 years. I think the point that Jori, you make about McCaffrey and them trying to avoid saying it's McCaffrey, but it's McCaffrey. You also saw McCaffrey go through a spate of injuries, right? And the big scary thing when
to me was a compelling part.
Yeah, it's compelling because we've seen the back end of that now, right? Like when they dealt for McCaffrey, we're like, oh my God, holy. Like they're paying him all this money and they dealt all these picks and this guy's wound, tighter than 600 rubber bands, wrapped around a golf ball. And he's just a soft tissue injury away from making this look horrible. But it hasn't happened, right? Like they've been able to keep him healthy. He's been able to keep himself healthy. He's surrounded by a better team. And I think you could argue that Saquon could have that second career that McCaffrey has. Went through injuries, scared you. You're like, oh my gosh, he always seems like, we're just waiting for the big injury. Well, maybe he has a sustained run that McCaffrey has had in San Francisco of health. And they're paying him less, right? It's not the unbelievable deal that McCaffrey, did in San Francisco. As you said, they didn't give up any draft assets, which is, it's huge. And he fits what they like to do, right? Like he fits into that offense. And you can maximize what you're going to get out of him as long as you can keep him healthy. So, and they continue to have the best offensive lines in football year after year, partially because of the talent that's on it, but also because they have a coach who knows how to turn guys into serviceable offensive linemen every time there's a hole. So,
which there is in the departure of Jason Kelce.
There is, yeah. That's a sizable hole, both in the locker room and then on the talent on the field. But it made a lot of sense to me, and especially when I looked at the numbers, I'm like, yeah, okay, it's the big quarterback contract, but realistically, they're pinning themselves to him for 2 years. As when I talk to an agent and. He always uses the phrase pinning. Like, what are you pinning yourself to? What are you pinning? Where are you pinning this player to a roster? What deal are you, pinning them to? And for the Eagles, they're pinning themselves to a 2-year contract. And that's not the end of the world to me. And it's a player that fits what they like to do. I think there was value there. I think if you talk about Saquon signing with another team that's not the Eagles, that don't run that scheme, that don't have the kind of offensive lines they do, maybe I'm a little more skeptical of this deal. I think it's the right guy in the right place.
Yeah, 2 notes I'd add is, one, when we talk about the Jason Kelce hole in the locker room, I actually think that's relevant here because by no means do you sign a locker room leader who can't produce on the field, and Saquon can produce on the field. But we kind of saw this model where in New York, Daniel Jones isn't necessarily the most vocal leader, the most vocal locker room guy. And Saquon was very comfortable being able to take up that mantle, kind of speak on behalf of the locker room, but do it in a way that was respectful to Daniel Jones. And I think, again, I've been in the Giants locker room. I'm based in New York. There's like Daniel Jones locker room, then a break where people enter the showers. And then there's like 2-3 lockers, and then there's Saquon. So Daniel's kind of like within earshot of everything Saquon's saying, but he's just more comfortable letting Saquon be that guy. And I think that works well for Jalen Hurts because, again, having been in the Eagles locker room plenty of times through November, December, and January this year, there were some questions of like, hey, Jalen's not standing up for Nick Sirianni. Hey, Jalen's kind of like more into the cliches than he is into being like, here's how I'm actually feeling. And sometimes you just need a real guy. And someone made the point to me again. You have Jason Kelsey, Brandon Graham, and Fletcher Cox, who have been the core of that team for so long. And now you have Jason and Fletcher retiring. And so I think that Saquon actually, in addition to producing, which obviously is a non-starter to make a deal like this, will have that presence. And the last thing I'll say is that I remember I did a feature with Christian McCaffrey and his agent Joel Siegel after they signed that deal. And their whole argument to the Carolina Panthers when he made his extension was Christian speaks 3 languages. He runs, he receives, he blocks. And so that is more valuable than running alone. And they compared even his receiving numbers to other receivers across the league. And so I think when you look at the numbers, and particularly the contract price for a running back who is able to be as involved in the receiving game as a few guys in the league are. This isn't someone who does it a couple times or who happens to like catch it and run with it, but was really still basically a run in terms of how it's doing, like actual guys who can be a receiving threat. Then you start to look at the contract less as, is this the top of the running back market? And more as, is it kind of splitting the difference between the running back market and the receiver market?
And the wide receiver market, right.
I also think that modern roster construction seems to be very based in the concept of make our strengths stronger. This Eagles offense has a lot to be really happy about, right? Like they're going to be difficult to defend, much like we've made the McCaffrey conversation here, but I think there's a 49ers conversation too, like which the devil you're trying to take away becomes really difficult for defensive coordinators to figure out how to stop San Francisco because they can beat you 100 ways. This does some of that for the Eagles too. So I mean, frankly, I love the signing. Can I ask a very basic question here though? Like, are the Giants just going to suck? Because I mean, other than Saquon, the Giants haven't had a lot to really look forward to. And I'm trying to figure out, like, C-Rob, it just feels like the Giants are going to be bad.
I would say they are in a period of transition. I just
said
don't
like
know
a professional. I asked if they're going to suck, and C-Rob's like, I would say it's a period of transition.
I don't know what the transition is. You know, I mean, I think you look at it and I've said it before where you're screwed and you're dead in the water to me if you don't have the quarterback that you really truly believe is your guy. And I don't think with the Giants right now, I wouldn't say that's in the green. You know, I think if we all sat here and made a prediction now, it feels more likely that Daniel Jones isn't with the team after 2024 than is with the team in 2024. That's a really bad spot to be in. You look at the pass catchers. It's funny. I see in my timeline, I'll always catch like Giants fans or, you know, in the comments or whatever under tweets, they'll be arguing about players or whatever. And they all think Jalen Hyatt's going to be this greatest, you know, awesome player who's going to develop into like the next Odell Beckham Jr. And I'm like, okay, I can see things to like about his game. I just don't know how you're projecting something like that right now. Like he's still in such a developmental stage. So I even look at the receiver. They could go take a receiver, right, with their first pick. They could take, maybe it's Rome Odunze, right? And I don't know. It's a tough spot, I think, for Brian Daboll to be in right now, sitting there and maybe not fully knowing that you have the quarterback that you need, losing, as Jori said, a vocal person in that locker room who was a leader and who, by the way, as we talked about on this show, when he was on, I mean, it was a completely different offense, right? Like when he played well. Yeah, he really is. Completely, total game changer when he is healthy. And he would have one of those games where you're like, there's so much special about this guy. And now you've lost that. And so I think the Giants are this. I'm surprised that we're sort of in this element of disarray with the Giants after the start that they had under Brian Daboll. It feels like we've taken so many steps backwards, and now I don't even fully understand what exactly they're aiming for offensively.
Well, I kind of get the sense that, again, we're still in March, we're still in free agency, and we haven't hit the draft yet, and we have more we can do. And so right now, the Giants offense is a major question mark, but let's not forget that they made that big splash for Brian Burns, and now we're going to have Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence, and Kayvon Thibodeau on the defensive line. And so I think it's sort of like
defensively.
Right. And so I think the Giants are kind of saying, like, at this stage in the process, we believe our best move is to go in on our defense. You're going against a division where I don't know what the Commanders are doing. We'll have to see what they're doing, although they, in theory, should have one of the top rookie quarterbacks. But then you have the Cowboys' explosive offense, the Eagles' explosive offense. And now the Giants are like, if we can't stop that, we can't win. And so I think you sort of have this question of what's going to be their offensive market. And it's interesting, though, because Brian Daboll's an offensive coach who's brought in to, in large part, spark the offense and create a Josh Allen-like effect with Daniel Jones or another quarterback. But I don't think do we know for sure that Daniel Jones is their 2024 quarterback? I think it's possible, but I think between the out on his contract and his injury history and needing to recover from it, I don't think it's 100%. And so I still think that there's room for the Giants to make a move. But no matter who they bring in, they're so far behind on their offensive cast that adding a piece or two or a great receiver in the draft or a quarterback, it's going to be hard. And I think the only way that the Giants have a successful offensive season is if whoever they take in the first round is like some really solid, like either, I would say they need some skill player to go off, Daniel Jones to stay healthy, and their offensive line to stay stable and healthy. And I just think that's a lot to ask for.
As a fan of a team that's been in a transitional period for roughly 20 years, I get the pain of hearing transitional period. I've convinced myself with absolutely no reporting, by the way, that the Giants are going to move up to 4. I have nothing to base this on. I've just convinced myself quarterbacks are going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Arizona's going to move down from 4 to 6. They'll get a haul to do it, and they'll still get one of the top 2 wide receivers that they're in love with. I've convinced myself of this because I'm convinced the Raiders have no shot at a quarterback. This is the only thing I can make sense. Speaking of quarterbacks, there is a ripple effect to the signing of Kirk Cousins, and it impacts not only the draft, but it impacts some of the biggest names in the NFL. We'll tell you about it when we come back. All right, Kirk Cousins is rich. He's dirty rich. He's filthy rich. Dinner on Kirk for the rest of his life. And we all know that anyway, right? Like, we already knew he was rich. But there are impacts to this current contract. And C-Rob, you wrote about it this week for Yahoo. When you start talking about Kirk Cousins, this impacts everybody from guys that we talk about every single Sunday to Justin Fields. I want to start with Fields, though, because I'm trying to figure out, for all the conversation we've had, where the hell Justin Fields going to end up next year?
Yeah, I was talking to Jori about this last night, where I had an agent who clearly saw this coming late last week, and he's telling me, like, you should do this story. It was like, their Fields, there's not going to be any starting spots for him. They're going to be stuck with him, and they're going to have to start looking at backup spots. And I didn't believe it. And then by the end of the weekend, I was like, crap, he was completely right. And that's because Kirk took a major player off the field for him, which is Atlanta. And then Russ went to, Pittsburgh. And, I know that there were people in that organization that really liked Justin Fields coming out. And I have to believe that if they had missed out on Russ, there's potential that they could have traded for Justin Fields. And, now you have the plethora of quarterbacks that, no one's absolutely slammed into a wall. So it still looks like at bare minimum, there's going to be 4 first-round quarterbacks, if not 5, if not maybe, if things get really crazy, 6. So you have the Bears sitting there, and the market, we wrote this in December, the market was going to be softer for him than they realized in terms of compensation anyway, because there was only really 1 year of control. No one wanted to tack on that 5th-year option unless he just finished the 2023 season blazing. He would have had to have had a finish like Jordan Love. Like, he would have had to have just lit it up and completely changed what you really thought about his trajectory and the timeline for him as a passer. That didn't happen. So, now the Bears are sitting there and they're staring at this and they're going, okay, well, here's one of these ripples with Kirk. Took out the Falcons and, put Justin Fields into a position now when the Bears look out there, they're going, A, we're probably going to get less draft compensation than we might have initially thought because there's just not a number of bidders. B, as this agent said to me, he's like, you got to start looking at, if you're an agent, you're trying to help facilitate a trade, I'm starting to look at backup positions in the NFL, like where are backup slots? And I'm not necessarily just looking for the worst starting quarterback and go, hey, let me get him in behind the worst starting quarterback so he can beat this guy out. He's like, no, you really want it to be a good situation, a good team. He fits the scheme. He could possibly help them even in the backup position. Like, maybe they can design some packages here and there for him over the course of the season. A team that could want to keep him through the entirety of the 2024 season because they're good, right? And you want a quality backup who's got starting experience. And I think the Eagles fit that right now. I think the Philadelphia Eagles now fit. They have a backup quarterback need. I know Howie Roseman wants to address it. I don't think he wants to go into 2024 with Tanner McKee being the backup to Hurts. And I think he likes value, and there is some value there in Hurts, whether it's a player you plan to keep throughout 2024, it's a player who maybe you think you could generate some draft interest in him. There's a lot of different avenues, but so there's the Fields element of it, right? That Kirk impacted, but Tua's got to do an extension, right? Jared Goff's got to do an extension. Kirk's money is going to affect those extensions because I think now you're looking at players with their floor, bare minimum, 50, 51, 52 million APY. The guaranteed money is going to be dramatically affected for those players. Dak's got to do an extension. I don't really put Dak in that group because I feel like Dak, if and when he does the extension, it's hard for me not to see him being at the top of the quarterback pile once again. I think even
Rob, let me ask you this. What's the top of the quarterback pile going to look like then? If 50-51 is where we're getting with Goff, what are we talking about for somebody like Dak when he comes up?
Well, you just have to, beat the best, deal that's currently on the market. I'm not saying, you're going to jump, you're not going to gap it and push it to 60 unless you want to piss people off. I don't know if you want to get into that box with the Cleveland Browns and have everybody all upset about what you did with a quarterback contract. But no, I think Dak is.
And the biggest question is, when is this deal happening? Because that's the biggest thing with the Cowboys' last negotiations with Dak is that they basically negotiated for close to 2 years before getting the deal done. And so the price was very different when they ended than when they started. And so if the Cowboys get this deal done this summer compared to next year, it's going to cost something different.
But isn't that part of the reason why it makes sense? If the Cowboys genuinely believe that Dak is their future, doesn't it make sense today to overpay rather than get into next time? Because every summer that this continues, the average annual value is just going to continue to go up and up and up and up.
It made sense when they could have had him at 30. It made sense when they could have had him at...
I admire your commitment to logic and your belief that people want to do what's best and make sense. That is not how Jerry Jones operates. I think if the Cowboys had deal inertia then, how much more so do they have deal inertia now? Hence all of the craziness and Cowboys fan panic that they're not doing anything in free agency. I do not think that the Cowboys feel moved by the idea that someone would cost more. If they did, they would have a deal with CeeDee Lamb right now.
I also think that Todd France isn't on their Christmas card list either. I'll just say that. I think there's some long-standing acrimony. Maybe it's not all the way on the surface, but I'm sure that the last time they went through negotiations with Todd, there are some marks left on Stephen Jones that probably, look, nobody's going to say it plays into it, but I think tough negotiations always linger in the back of people's heads. And especially when the next negotiation is a scenario where realistically, people don't want to hear this, but realistically coming off the season Dak had, and I know everybody, you got to factor in the postseason. I get that, but still lesser players than Dak became the richest player in football. So I don't see why you wouldn't go to the negotiating table, look at the last deal and give me $1 more.
Let me ask you guys this from the teams you talk to, because I think look at Kirk as the great example of this. The Vikings were really at a cut bait process, right? Like you can't pay, you're not going to win the Super Bowl with him. You don't want to pay that much for him. So they're willing to start all the way over at the quarterback position. We start talking about some of these values for quarterbacks that are good, but not Mahomes, right? Is it worth, from a team standpoint, is it worth the 40, 50, 55 million that you're going to get into some of these guys? Or are we going to see more teams essentially just throwing up their hands with good quarterbacks and going back to the draft, which is a total crapshoot just because it blows up your salary cap to do it this way?
How many good quarterbacks, I'm asking both of you this, how many good quarterbacks have teams ever let walk? Good quarterbacks, genuinely good quarterbacks. How many have teams let go to free agents?
Washington and Kirk Cousins, and what most people think Washington does is the opposite of what you want to do.
And now Kirk is going to make bare minimum $320 million in his career. So it just doesn't happen. Like I think what ultimately happens is I think you get into a scenario where you start to stare at not what you have, but like, what wouldn't you, like, where's the hole? You just start looking at the hole and you go, okay, well, how do we fill that? Like and Jerry's talked about this before. talked about going through those years and not having a quarterback and remembering what that's like. And, we heard a general manager say at the combine, we did this because if it works out, nobody's going to give a shit. And if it doesn't work out, I'm going to be fired anyway. So, I mean, it's, there is an element of that. Now, Dallas is different, obviously, because nobody's firing that general manager.
Sure.
Nobody's firing it's
but
Jerry and Steven aren't going anywhere.
Minnesota made a conscious decision to walk away from a quarterback that another franchise values at $100 million. And I would argue that Minnesota has absolutely no idea how to get another quarterback now. Like, just the concept of we're going to draft one, I don't think they're going to be in a position to draft. I think Minnesota, Denver, and the Raiders are all screwed when it comes to trying to get a quarterback in this year's draft. So you just let somebody walk, and you're like, we'll figure it out. And as you said earlier, C-Rob, I don't think in the modern NFL you can win without a quarterback. So I don't know what you're supposed to do. Do you overpay for mediocrity, or do you just continually roll the dice and hope and pray?
Coming off an Achilles, though, right? Let's be real. Like, Kirk is still coming off an Achilles. I don't know I assume he's going to be fine. I'm assuming that, but he is coming off an injury. And you did it after giving him guaranteed contract, after all this guaranteed money. And I think what happened is in the front office, they're like, we're not going to just keep doing this. We're not just going to keep rolling out all this guaranteed money over and over and over. I'm sure there was an element there of going, we paid you a lot guaranteed. Maybe this time you don't have to have the max level guarantees that you really want. And he didn't get a fully guaranteed deal in Atlanta, but he got $100 million added to that bank account, regardless of, anything else that happens. I mean, that's a lot of Kohl's bucks. Okay. For him, he could go buy a Kohl's. He could probably buy the entire chain of Kohl's at this point by the time he finishes his career. I get, Minnesota kind of feeling like, hey, we have a line there. And I'll also say this. I don't think it was 100% in Minnesota that everybody was just like, hey, yeah, let's go ahead and move on from this. I think there's an element in the building that was like, this is a good quarterback. We're competitive. We have a good team around him. We can make these other additions and, it'd be good for us to keep Kirk. And then I think there's another element in the building that's like, we have to have a line in the sand here and we have to stick to that. And that's how we ended up where we are. I'll be curious to see as we travel outward from this situation in a year or 2 years or whatever, maybe finding out that there was some differing opinion or maybe there were some people inside the building that are like, let's not let Kirk go. Let's try to figure this out.
And I think if you want to know whether Kirk thought everyone in Minnesota was on the same page, I didn't feel it was coincidental the number of times that he said in his Atlanta introductory press conference and also his introductory interview with the in-house team media, how notable it was to him that in Atlanta, the owner, general manager, and head coach were on the same page. He made that very clear that was notable, that it felt good to be, quote, believed in. It felt good when Kyle Pitts made him feel wanted. I mean, there was definitely some, I'm not saying he was taking shots at anyone. I'm just saying that maybe subconsciously he noticed a difference there.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. And it's part of the reason that we're going to continue to have work every week leading up to the draft because too many teams need quarterbacks for it just to get quiet. I'm going to be back Monday with Zero Blitz. You can follow us on social media, of course, at Jason Fitz, at Jori Epstein, at Charles Robinson, and at SJ Rochelle for Stone doing God's work behind the glass. As always, C-Rob, tell everybody how we can continue to support the tremendous legacy of Terez Paylor.
Yeah, it's All Juice team time. This is Charles McDonald and I are working on this year's All Juice team as we speak. As always, if you want to get an All Juice tee or sweatshirt from breakingtea.com/Terez, remember that the proceeds from that purchase go to support the Terez A. Paylor Scholarship at Howard University. You can also contribute to that directly, as well as the scholarship in his name at Missouri if you check out our podcast description.
Well, just like free agency is going to continue rolling, we will too. We'll be back next Thursday with more inside coverage. Thanks for hanging out with us.